Well, guys, FIFA has finally released the format for the 2026 World Cup here in North America with the expanded field of 48 teams that we will see for the first time. And while I certainly believe that they picked the correct format for this expanded field, there were certainly some other options that they were looking at. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and look at some of these other options that FIFA were considering for this 2026 World Cup. Now, just a little insight on these first two formats that we're going to show. These these first two only consist of 40 teams. So I think these were two formats that they had kind of looked at early on before they'd finally come to the conclusion of adding 48 teams to the tournament. But these were still two formats I think that were somewhat in consideration early on. And as you can see, this first format had 40 teams, 8 groups of 5 with the 2014 knockout, which would have meant 3 teams out of each group would have advanced to the knockout stages. And I can only presume that with that, you would have had the winners of each of the 8 groups would have gotten a first round bye in the knockout stages, while the second and third place teams would have been selected and faced one another before finally seeing the first place teams in the round of 16. And again, the second one with only 40 teams as well. But again, it would have looked a little bit more traditional in the terms of the fact that we would have seen groups of 4. However, it would have been 10 groups of 4 with a 16 team knockout, meaning that every group winner would have automatically advanced. However, only 6 second place teams out of the 10 would have been able to advance to the knockout stages, which would have looked somewhat similar to how we've seen the Euros with some of these third place teams advancing out of the groups as well. But again, like the first format as well, I think both of these were kind of pushed to the side pretty early on, especially once FIFA, again, of course, decided to go with 48 teams in the field instead. Now, this is where things really start to look interesting, in my opinion, because as you can tell, it's got a 32 team opening playoff, which I would assume means that the top 16 teams in the world, based off of FIFA's rankings, would have gotten basically a first round bye with this. And then the 16 winners out of those playoffs would have come together with the top 16, making a group of 32. And then from there, we would have probably seen a traditional format like what we have today with 8 groups of 4, 16 team knockout, and everything looks normal. It's just that extra game for those teams that weren't ranked as high as the top 16 that they had to go through, which, in my opinion, I think is really disappointing and kind of shallow, especially considering what some of these teams go through in terms of how long the process is to qualify for the World Cup, to then come into this and essentially they have just a one-off game, and if they make it, great. If not, they're gone. And again, it's really based off how you look at it. You can look at it sort of as those intercontinental playoffs where some of these teams have to go against each other, like Australia and Peru, New Zealand, etc. And if they win, they advance. If they lose, they're gone. But at least with those intercontinental playoffs, if you do win that contest, you're at least automatically guaranteed 3 games in the biggest tournament on the planet once you get to that point. So the fact that you would qualify just to get to this section of the tournament and then potentially just be eliminated after 90 minutes, it's probably pretty excruciating and pretty painful for a lot of these federations if that were to happen and FIFA had selected this process. But luckily, we avoided all of that. But this was certainly a format that I think that they were at least somewhat considering early on. And this fourth format, really, it seemed like for a while, this is what FIFA had their eyes set on and what they were going to come to the conclusion to, which had 16 groups of 3 and a 32 team knockout. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the idea of a 32 team knockout, especially if the field is going to be expanded to 48 teams. I think having that extra round in the knockouts is awesome. However, a couple things that I have issues with is the fact that if you have groups of 3, that really kind of takes away the sense of having a group of death, or as these groups come out once the draw is finalized, having that group of 4 that you look at and think, wow, like this is by far, or in my opinion, certainly the toughest group out of you know each group that we're looking at. And in my opinion, I feel like 3 doesn't really give off that same vibe or connection in terms of looking at it and saying, wow, like this group's going to be so much more superior, so much more difficult to get out of. Not only that, but we see how much excitement and intensity a group of 4 brings in terms of having simultaneous group stage finales. And with only having 3 teams in each group, you can't offer that, which of course then leads to the direction of, if we kept this format, the possibility of 2 teams going into their final game only needing, say, a draw or a certain number in terms of goal differential, and 2 teams potentially kind of helping each other out instead of just playing it as is, waiting for their two other opponents in the group as well to finalize their game, and really seeing just how these groups can unfold within the final 90 minutes of the group. So the fact of only having groups of three, in my opinion, was very difficult, and I think would have caused a lot of problems for FIFA. But luckily for us, they wound up deciding against this format. Now you're probably sitting here thinking, dude, you just sat here and criticized format number 4. Why are you giving it a B minus? Well, for me personally, I still like the fact that it has 48 teams over 40. And despite the fact that it only has groups of three, I like having an expanded knockout to 32 teams if you're going to expand the field. And that's pretty much why I gave format number 2 a D plus, is that if you've only got 16 teams advancing out of a 40 team field, I just don't feel that that's enough, especially if you're telling some second place teams who play really well through 3 games that they're still going home. And then, of course, format number 3, I like the traditional sense after you get past the playoff, but to think that you qualify for as long as you do, to then wind up only playing a 90-minute game potentially and being eliminated altogether after doing all that work for several years is just not necessary, in my opinion. So that's why I gave format number 3 an F. And even though format number 1 is at the highest with the B plus, it still only has 40 teams, which again, in my opinion, I don't think is enough. But I do like the fact that it has 3 teams out of each group advancing. And last but certainly not least, the format that FIFA has finally decided on for the 2026 World Cup: 12 groups of 4, 32 team knockout with a 48 team field. Guys, I really like the fact that they're still keeping groups of 4 for the possibility of having a group of death or multiple groups of death. We're still going to have simultaneous group stage finales, and the knockout stage being expanded from 16 to 32 teams, in my opinion, is fantastic. I really like the fact that we'll have that extra round added to it. And again, I think each team that qualifies for this tournament should, at minimum, get 3 games. I think that's what they deserve, which is really good for still having these groups of 4. But then having that daunting task of 1 extra knockout stage game added to this bracket to try and become champions of the world is really exciting for me as well. And I think that's a great part of what's being added with this new format. Guys, as always, thanks so much for watching. Please let us know in the comments. Tell us what your favorite format is, and even possibly what are some teams that you're looking forward to seeing with this new format come in 2026. As always, guys, really appreciate the love. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, peace out.